The late summer of 1939 was heavy with the smell of gunpowder and death. The once green hills of Hunan had turned into a graveyard of men, machines, and dreams. Japanese troops were advancing south, pushing through central China with terrifying precision, while the city of Yueyang, gateway to Changsha, waited in dread. The people had already heard stories of Nanjing. They knew what the Imperial Japanese Army was capable of. But few could imagine that the next chapter of horror would not be written by soldiers alone, but by children barely old enough to hold a rifle. The Seeds of War. The First Battle of Changsha was more than a clash between two armies. It was a test of survival for a nation on its knees. China, still reeling from the loss of Shanghai and Nanjing, had been fighting for 2 relentless years. Entire provinces were burned and millions displaced. In rural Hunan, villages had emptied their sons to feed the war machine. But when the older boys were gone, when fathers lay buried or lost in battle, eyes turned toward the younger ones, the ones still standing, still breathing. Schools were abandoned, classrooms became barracks. Chalkboards were painted with slogans, "Defend the motherland, drive out the invader." In the towns near Yueyang, nationalist recruiters and local militias began to form units of what they called young patriots. Boys between 12 and 16, some even younger, were handed wooden rifles for drills, later replaced by battered Mausers and Arisakas scavenged from the dead. They were told they were heroes, they believed it. March to the front. In August 1939, the Japanese 11th Army began pushing toward Hunan. General Seishiro Itagaki, a veteran of the Kwantung Army, commanded the offensive. His goal was clear: seize Changsha, cut the Chinese railway supply lines, and break the resistance in central China. Opposing him was General Zhu Yue, commander of the Chinese Ninth War Area, a seasoned strategist known as the Tiger of Changsha. Zhu understood that the defense of Hunan was not only military, it was psychological. If Changsha fell, so too would the spirit of resistance. To hold the line, every able-bodied man was needed, but as the Japanese approached Yueyang, even that wasn't enough. Local militia captains turned to the only ones left, the boys. In one of these units was Li Ming, a 15-year-old student from a small school near Yueyang's eastern gate. His father had died the previous winter fighting in Wuhan. His mother had no tears left. She watched silently as he left home, a rifle slung across his back, a canvas satchel holding dry rice and a lucky coin. He joined the Hunan Youth Defense Regiment, a ragtag mix of students, orphans, and farmers' sons, barely 100 strong. Their commander, Captain Zhao Cheng, was a veteran of the 1937 Shanghai campaign, now too injured to fight on the front. He trained the boys with what little ammunition they had. Their motto was painted in red on a torn banner: "Better to die standing than live kneeling." Into the inferno. By early September, the Japanese 101st Division reached the outskirts of Yueyang. Artillery shells rained down, ripping through the city's ancient walls. The air was thick with dust and the screams of civilians fleeing south toward Changsha. The Hunan Youth Regiment took position near the Xiang River. Their orders were simple: delay the Japanese advance at all costs. For many, it was their first time hearing live gunfire. Li Ming crouched behind a shattered wall, his hands trembling around a rifle almost as tall as he was. Beside him, 12-year-old Wei Jun whispered a prayer his mother had taught him. Their commander moved between them, shouting over the explosions: "Hold your fire until you see their faces. Aim steady, make every bullet count." When the Japanese infantry finally emerged from the haze, their bayonets glinting under the afternoon sun, the boys fired wildly. The air filled with smoke, fire, and terror. Several Japanese soldiers fell. But when the ammunition ran out, the boys reached for grenades, most of which were defective, or charged forward with bayonets fixed, shouting battle cries that cracked under the weight of fear. By nightfall, their position was overrun. Captain Zhao was hit by shrapnel and fell without a sound. The surviving boys scattered into the ruins, hiding among corpses and rubble. Li Ming and a handful of others were captured the next morning. Captivity. The Japanese soldiers who found them laughed at first, disbelieving that these tiny, dirt-covered figures were enemy combatants. But when they saw the rifles, the armbands, the tattered banner, they understood. "Children," one soldier muttered, Chinese soldiers' children. The prisoners were tied and brought to a field camp north of Yueyang. There, the Japanese officers debated what to do. Some argued they should be treated as combatants, others as prisoners of war. But mercy was rare in the Imperial Army, especially in China, where hatred had hardened into policy. At dusk, the boys were lined up before a trench. An officer read a statement in broken Mandarin. "The Emperor's soldiers do not fight children, but those who take up arms must face the consequence of war." The younger ones cried. Li Ming did not. He looked at the setting sun, his lips moving silently, perhaps a prayer, perhaps his mother's name. The gunfire that followed was quick. The field fell silent again. But the story of Yueyang's child soldiers did not end there. When the smoke cleared over Yueyang, the air hung heavy with the smell of burned rice fields and gunpowder. The Xiang River, once glimmering under the summer sun, now ran dark with silt and ash. The cries of the living had faded, replaced by the stillness of the dead. But not everyone who fell in that field had died. Among the shallow trenches and broken bodies, Li Ming opened his eyes. The bullet that should have killed him had grazed his shoulder. He lay half-buried beneath the weight of two of his friends, both motionless. For hours he didn't move, afraid the soldiers might still be nearby. When night came, he crawled through the mud, dragging himself toward the ruins of a nearby farmhouse. There he hid among the straw, bleeding, feverish, and alone. He had no bandages, no food, only a small piece of his torn regiment banner wrapped around his arm. The once bright red letters had faded, but the words were still there. "Better to die standing than live kneeling." The cost of defiance. The massacre of the child soldiers near Yueyang never made it into official reports. The Japanese army recorded it as the elimination of irregular guerrilla elements. To them, it was nothing more than another minor engagement in the long war for China. But for the people of Hunan, word spread quickly. Villagers whispered about the young patriots of Yueyang, boys who had fought until their last bullet and who were executed for their courage. Mothers carried their names like prayers. When the bodies were finally recovered by locals days later, they were buried together in an unmarked pit near the riverbank. Small wooden tablets carved by hand marked the spot. No generals, no flags, just names scratched into the wood by trembling fingers. Li Ming, barely alive, was found by an old farmer and his daughter. They took him in, cleaned his wounds with rice wine, and hid him from Japanese patrols. For weeks, he drifted between fever dreams, visions of his fallen comrades, of Captain Zhao's final words, and of the laughter of boys who would never grow old. When he finally woke, the war had moved south toward Changsha. The sounds of artillery echoed in the distance, but Yueyang had fallen silent. The Battle for Changsha. By late September 1939, the First Battle of Changsha reached its climax. The Japanese 11th Army pushed deep into Hunan, confident that Chinese forces were collapsing. Cities like Yueyang, Miluo, and Xiangtan had already been devastated. But General Zhu Yue had been waiting for this moment. He lured the Japanese deep into the region's narrow valleys where supply lines grew thin and ambushes waited at every turn. Chinese divisions struck back with coordinated counterattacks, cutting off the Japanese advance. The terrain favored the defenders: dense forests, winding rivers, and hills that swallowed tanks and artillery. The same land that had buried the boys of Yueyang now became a graveyard for the invaders. It was in this chaos that Li Ming, barely 16, decided he could not stay hidden. Weak and thin, with a ragged scar across his shoulder, he made his way south, joining a group of Chinese partisans operating along the river. They called themselves the Resistance of the Xiang, a band of farmers, deserters, and refugees armed with stolen weapons and burning hatred. When he arrived, one of the older men looked him up and down and said, "You're too young to fight." Li Ming replied quietly, "So were they." Echoes of the fallen. The partisans fought in the shadows, sabotaging bridges, cutting supply lines, ambushing Japanese convoys that strayed too far from their base. For Li Ming, every raid was personal. Each explosion, each fallen soldier was a silent offering to the boys buried in Yueyang. As the main battle raged in Changsha, rumors spread of the child soldier who survived. Some claimed he fought like a ghost, appearing out of the mist to strike and vanish again. Others said he carried with him a blood-stained banner, torn and frayed, that once belonged to his fallen regiment. By the time the Japanese offensive collapsed in early October 1939, the legend had already begun to take shape. The Japanese were forced to retreat north, suffering heavy losses. For the first time in the war, China had achieved a major defensive victory. The people celebrated in Changsha, lighting incense and offering rice to the spirits of the dead. But for Li Ming, there was no victory, only the ache of memory. He returned once more to Yueyang, now a ruined shell of a city. He found the gravesite by the river and knelt there for hours, whispering the names of his friends. Then, from his satchel, he took out a notebook, a schoolbook he had carried through the war, and began to write. "We were young," he wrote. "We did not understand death, but we knew what it meant to lose our home. They called us children, but we were the sons of China, and though our bodies fall, our names will not." The Forgotten Story. After the war, many of these stories vanished. Records were destroyed, villages rebuilt, and memories buried beneath the ashes of time. The Republic of China kept few documents on irregular youth regiments, and the Japanese archives made no mention of the Yueyang incident. Only fragments survived: oral testimonies, local memorials, and faded photographs of boys in oversized uniforms. Some historians dismissed them as folklore. But in 1973, a researcher from Hunan University uncovered a collection of journals hidden in a village shrine. Among them was Li Ming's notebook. Inside were 27 names, the boys of the Hunan Youth Defense Regiment, and their final words before the battle. It was the first written record confirming what had long been whispered across the villages of Hunan. One entry, dated September 15, 1939, read, "We will fight tomorrow. If I do not return, tell my mother I am not afraid." Signed simply, Wei Jun, age 12. The weight of memory. Today, on the outskirts of Yueyang, near the banks of the Xiang River, stands a small monument, a stone slab carved with 27 names. Locals still bring flowers and incense. Few tourists visit. There are no grand parades, no documentaries on national television. Just the quiet remembrance of those who were too young to be soldiers, yet too brave to surrender. Li Ming's fate remains uncertain. Some say he died during the Second Battle of Changsha in 1941. Others claim he survived, living out his days as a schoolteacher in a nearby village. But in his writings, one passage stands out. "A nation that forgets its children forgets its soul. We were not heroes, we were only boys who believed our country needed us." And that belief, naive, pure, and tragic, was what gave birth to the legend of the Forgotten Children of Changsha. The Xiang River has seen centuries of blood, but none like that of 1939. Its waters still whisper the names of the forgot, carrying them south toward Changsha and beyond. The locals say that when the mist rises at dawn, you can still hear the faint echo of boys marching, their wooden rifles tapping in rhythm with the rippling current. For decades after the war, the story of Yueyang's child soldiers remained buried beneath layers of silence, first by fear, then by politics, and finally by time. Those who had lived through it had little reason to speak. Survivors were few, witnesses even fewer, but memory, as always, finds a way to surface. The return of testimony. In the 1980s, after China began to reopen and re-examine its wartime history, an elderly man appeared at a veterans' meeting in Changsha. His name was Li Ming, though few believed it at first. The man was frail, his voice soft, and his hands trembled when he held a pen. He introduced himself quietly. "I once fought near Yueyang. I was 15. When historians asked for proof, he handed them a faded red cloth, tattered, blood-stained, and nearly unreadable. Only a few characters could still be made out. "Better to die standing." That fragment alone was enough to silence the room. Over the next several weeks, Li Ming spoke in long, halting sentences, recalling faces, sounds, and the smell of gunpowder. He described Captain Zhao's calm under fire, Wei Jun's final prayer, and the cold stare of the Japanese officer who read the execution order. Every word was recorded, transcribed, and later compared with local oral histories gathered from the villages around Yueyang. The details matched down to the description of the field, the time of the attack, even the handmade banner. For the first time, the tragedy of Yueyang's child soldiers was no longer myth, it was history. Uncovering the graves. In 1984, a team of archaeologists and local volunteers began excavating the area north of Yueyang, guided by Li Ming's memory. The field he described was now overgrown with wild grass, rice paddies, and eucalyptus trees. But beneath the soil, they found what they were looking for. Fragments of rusted rifles, buttons from torn uniforms, the corroded remains of belt buckles engraved with the emblem of the Chinese Youth Corps, and deeper still, the bones, small, fragile, and countless. Each discovery was handled with silence and care. The villagers who helped wept openly, their tears mixing with the mud. Some recognized family names on the few wooden markers that had survived. At the edge of the site, Li Ming knelt as the remains were lifted from the earth. His shoulders shook, but he said nothing. When asked how he felt, he whispered, "They've waited long enough to come home." The recovered remains were reburied with honor at a small memorial site overlooking the river. For the first time, the young defenders of Yueyang were given names, a monument, and the respect denied to them by history. The politics of memory. Yet even in remembrance, truth faced obstacles. The government of the time, wary of focusing too heavily on child soldiers, was hesitant to publicize the discovery. They feared it might reflect desperation, chaos, and moral compromise during the early war years. Official textbooks made only passing reference to local youth militias in Hunan. The word children was omitted. For Li Ming, this silence was unbearable. He spent his remaining years traveling between schools, telling anyone who would listen about what had happened in 1939. Teachers invited him quietly, parents sometimes protested, afraid the stories were too dark for their children. But he insisted, "If they were old enough to die, your children are old enough to know." In his final recorded speech, delivered at a Changsha middle school in 1989, he said, "Do not mistake silence for peace. Peace is when the dead are remembered, not when they are forgotten." A year later, Li Ming passed away in his sleep. He was 71. Legacy of the Forgotten Regiment. After his death, his personal effects were donated to the Hunan Provincial Museum, his notebook, his banner fragment, and a single rusted rifle bolt. They are displayed in a quiet corner exhibit titled "Children of the War That Never Ended." Few visitors notice it, but those who stop to read are often struck by the photographs. Faded, ghostly images of boys in oversized uniforms, staring into the camera with expressions far too old for their years. In the decades that followed, local historians and filmmakers tried to revive the story. A 2003 documentary titled The Children of Yueyang aired briefly on provincial television before being pulled for sensitivity concerns. Copies survive only in private archives. Today, the memorial still stands by the Xiang River, hidden behind a grove of willows. Every year on September 15th, a few elderly villagers bring incense and fruit. Children from nearby schools come to sweep the graves, though few understand the full weight of the names carved into the stone. And when the wind blows over the water, the old men say, "The river sings," the faint, haunting echo of voices that never had the chance to grow old. Epilogue: The Boy in the Bayonet. History often remembers its generals, not its children. But the battle for Changsha was won not by the strength of armies alone. It was held together by courage born from desperation, by boys like Li Ming and Wei Jun, who believed that even a child's sacrifice could help keep a nation alive. When we speak of wars, we count victories and defeats, yet in the fields near Yueyang there was neither. There was only the final lesson of innocence lost. The bones beneath the soil do not care for ideology or empire. They belong to a generation that was promised nothing and yet gave everything. In one of Li Ming's final journal entries, he wrote, "We were told that heroes never die, but if no one remembers them, they die twice. So long as the story of Yueyang's forgotten children is told, they will not die again." And when the mist rises over the Xiang River, their footsteps can still be heard marching through time toward a peace they never lived to see. The years turned into decades, and the roar of war faded into the quiet hum of progress. Hunan's fields once again grew rice and tea. The ruined walls of Yueyang were rebuilt, roads paved, and new bridges crossed the Xiang River. To the unknowing traveler, it became just another peaceful Chinese city, but beneath its surface, the land still remembered. Every rainfall unearthed relics of the past: a bullet casing, a rusted helmet, the corner of a corroded bayonet. Farmers would place them carefully on stone altars near their fields, offerings not to gods but to boys who never came home. Old villagers told their grandchildren, "Be kind to the soil, it carries the bones of our protectors." But with time, even these stories began to vanish. The generation who had lived through the First Battle of Changsha was dying out. Schools no longer taught the smaller tragedies, and the national narrative preferred the triumphs. The tale of the child soldiers of Yueyang, brave, heartbreaking, inconvenient, drifted again towards silence. Until one day the river stirred. Rediscovery. In 2014, a construction crew near Yueyang's eastern industrial district broke ground for a new shipping terminal. Their machines dug deep into what had once been farmland. Within hours, the digging halted. They had struck something. Police and archaeologists were called in. Beneath the dirt, they found bones, dozens of them. The remains were small, the teeth barely developed. Alongside them lay the fragments of fabric, corroded buttons, and rusted rifle parts stamped with 1930s serial numbers. At first, the discovery was mistaken for a forgotten burial from a village epidemic. But when historians examined the items, they recognized the symbols of the Chinese Youth Corps, the same unit mentioned in Li Ming's recovered journals. The grave was shallow, hurriedly made, and incomplete. It was the missing half of the Yueyang massacre site, the one Li Ming's memory had never been able to locate. The news spread quickly. Journalists arrived, followed by historians, film crews, and finally government officials. For a brief moment, the forgotten soldiers of Yueyang stood once again in the light of history. Voices from the past. Within weeks, local archives were re-examined, old testimonies were retranslated. A handful of letters written in pencil on rice paper surfaced in a Hunan family's attic. They had been sent by a teacher in 1939 to the parents of missing boys, letters that never reached their destination. One of them read, "Madam Wei, I regret to inform you that your son, Wei Jun, has not returned from duty near Yueyang. His courage was witnessed by all. He faced the enemy without fear. The nation owes him its life. May the mountains remember his name." There was no signature, only the school's faded stamp. Historians cross-referenced the handwriting with the letters Li Ming had mentioned in his diary, the same teacher who had trained the boys before they were conscripted. For the first time, the voices of Yueyang's lost children had found a path back to the present. Reckoning with memory. The discovery ignited a wave of discussion across China. Universities debated the moral and political implications of children in war. Documentaries and essays asked hard questions: who sent them to fight? Who decided their lives were expendable? Some blamed local militia commanders who had conscripted underage boys in desperation. Others argued that these children volunteered out of loyalty, not coercion, that in 1939 there was no childhood left in China, only survival. But amid the politics and scholarship, ordinary people saw something simpler: innocence crushed by war. An elderly survivor of the Changsha campaign, interviewed in 2015, said with tears in his eyes, "When the Japanese came, there were no adults left, only us boys. If we hadn't fought, who would have stood between the invaders and our mothers?" His words captured what statistics never could: the human heart that beats beneath every war story. The Memorial of the Lost. On September 15, 2019, the 80th anniversary of the First Battle of Changsha, a new memorial was unveiled near Yueyang's riverbank. It was built not by the government but by local teachers, historians, and villagers who pooled their savings. The monument was simple: a tall stone pillar inscribed with 27 names and one phrase at its base, taken from Li Ming's final notebook. "A nation that forgets its children forgets its soul." During the ceremony, schoolchildren stood in silence, holding white chrysanthemums. A single violin played an old revolutionary song, slow, mournful, echoing across the water. Elderly villagers, some in wheelchairs, wept openly. One woman placed a wooden toy soldier beside the memorial stone, a hand-carved figure, its paint long faded. She whispered, "For my brother, he was 12. That night, the monument glowed under the lanterns hung from the trees. The river shimmered with light, reflecting hundreds of floating candles. And for a moment, Yueyang, once the site of unimaginable horror, felt whole again. History reclaimed. In 2021, the Hunan Provincial Museum opened a permanent exhibit titled "The Children Who Defended Changsha." Visitors walked through dimly lit halls lined with the recovered artifacts: rusted helmets, torn schoolbooks, broken spectacles. At the center stood the reconstructed banner, its faded characters painstakingly restored. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Dedicated to the boys of the Hunan Youth Defense Regiment, defenders of their homeland, martyrs of their age." Visitors left offerings: origami cranes, toy rifles carved from wood, letters from modern students who had learned of their story. Many ended with the same phrase, "You are not forgotten." Li Ming's voice, recorded from one of his final interviews, played softly through hidden speakers. "We were told to die standing, but now I ask, let them live standing in memory, let their names grow old even if they never could." The river's promise. At sunrise, the Xiang River remains quiet. The fishermen cast their nets, the city hums awake, and life continues, but the river never forgets. Its waters run past the memorial, past the rebuilt schools and markets, carrying whispers of the boys who once stood on its banks. Their story now belongs not just to Yueyang or to Hunan, but to every soul who has ever lost their youth to war. When the mist settles low over the water, the villagers still tell their children to listen. "Do you hear that?" they say. "That's the sound of our guardians marching home." The ghosts of Hunan no longer wander unseen. They have found their rest not in silence but in remembrance. And as long as someone speaks their names, the forgotten children of Changsha will live forever, marching through history unbroken, unafraid, and finally home. For weeks after the execution near Yueyang, the fields were haunted by silence. The villagers who returned after the fighting found only remnants: broken helmets, torn shoes, rusted rifles half buried in the mud. Among them were the bodies of the boys, still in their makeshift uniforms. Some were never identified. Others were recognized only by a pendant, a school badge, or a piece of cloth with a name stitched by a mother's hand. One woman, Madame Li, searched for her son for 3 days among the dead. When she finally found him, she didn't cry. She washed his face, combed his matted hair, and whispered, "You did what your father could not." Then she covered him with the Chinese flag that had once hung in his school. These small acts of remembrance became the only resistance left for many families. But the government, locked in a desperate war, could not afford to mourn every fallen boy. In the chaos of 1939, there was no time for funerals, only for fighting. The turning of the tide. Even as tragedy unfolded in Yueyang, the Chinese forces regrouped under General Zhu Yue's command. Using the terrain and weather to their advantage, they lured the Japanese army deeper into Hunan's marshlands and hills. By late September, the Imperial forces, exhausted, undersupplied, and harassed by guerrillas, began to falter. Chinese counterattacks struck with ferocity, cutting off Japanese supply lines. Villagers armed with bamboo spears ambushed patrols. Militia snipers hid in rice paddies, waiting for officers to pass. It was a brutal, unforgiving kind of war. The Japanese 11th Army was forced to retreat northward, leaving behind thousands of their own dead. The First Battle of Changsha had ended, not in victory for Japan, but in a defiant stand that shocked even their commanders. Yet for the survivors of Yueyang, victory was hollow. The city lay in ruins. Nearly every street bore the mark of fire and blood, and for those who had lost sons, the news of the Japanese retreat meant little. The cost had already been paid in the lives of children. The survivors' testimony. A few of the child soldiers managed to escape the massacre. Among them was Wei Jun, the 12-year-old who had prayed behind a wall during the first day of fighting. He had fled into the woods when the Japanese opened fire, surviving on roots and river water for days before being rescued by Chinese partisans. Wei Jun later recalled, "We were told we were heroes, but heroes don't come home to nothing. Heroes don't wake up crying because they see their friends in dreams." He was one of the youngest survivors of the First Battle of Changsha. When the war ended 6 years later, he was 18, old enough to be drafted again. He refused. Instead, he dedicated his life to teaching in the same province, founding a small school named the Children of Hunan. Each year, on the anniversary of the battle, he would light incense and read the names of his fallen comrades. He never missed a year. The Japanese perspective. In post-war interrogations, a few Japanese officers spoke briefly about Yueyang. One of them, a junior lieutenant named Takeshi Mori, confessed that the execution of child soldiers had left an unsettling memory among his men. Some of us wanted to spare them, Mori said. But the order was clear: we could not treat them as civilians, they carried weapons. Still, it felt like something broke inside that day. Even victory tasted bitter after that. Decades later, Japanese historians would quietly acknowledge incidents involving child combatants across central China. But Yueyang's case remained obscure, overshadowed by larger atrocities and the enormity of the war's destruction. Only fragments, letters, diary entries, scattered oral histories kept the story alive. The Forgotten Chapter. In the years that followed, China rebuilt itself from ruins. Cities like Changsha rose again, but the memories of the child soldiers faded into the shadows of national history. The new regime after 1949 emphasized collective sacrifice but rarely spoke of the youngest who had fought. It wasn't until the 1980s that local historians in Hunan began collecting testimonies about the youth defenders of Yueyang. Old villagers recalled seeing columns of boys marching through the streets with red armbands. A few even remembered the sound of their voices, singing patriotic songs as they disappeared toward the front line. One faded photograph surfaced in 1987. It showed a group of barefoot boys in mismatched uniforms standing before a crumbling wall. A handwritten caption on the back read, "Hunan Youth Regiment 1939, taken before the battle." No one knew who took it, no one knew which of them survived. The weight of memory. By the turn of the century, fewer and fewer witnesses remained. But the story of the Yueyang child soldiers began to re-emerge through documentaries, local museums, and digital archives dedicated to forgotten heroes. In 2015, the Hunan Provincial Museum unveiled a small exhibit titled "The Children Who Fought." Inside were relics recovered from the battlefield: a rusted rifle, a school notebook with arithmetic problems, and a child-sized helmet dented by a bullet. Visitors often stopped in silence before one display, a folded school banner, its faded red characters still visible. "Better to die standing than live kneeling." It was the same slogan that had once fluttered over the trenches of Yueyang. Echoes across generations. Modern scholars debate whether the use of child soldiers in the Second Sino-Japanese War was an act of desperation or of patriotic zeal. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. These children were victims of circumstance, caught between propaganda, poverty, and the unstoppable tide of war. But for the people of Hunan, they were also symbols of courage. Their sacrifice, though tragic, became part of the moral backbone of China's resistance. When asked why he continued to tell their story, an aging historian replied, "Because nations forget their children first, and if we forget them, we forget who we were when the world tried to destroy us." Yueyang today, the Xiang River runs quiet, reflecting the gray clouds above the hills, but beneath its calm surface lies the soil of battle: rusted metal, fragments of uniforms, bones that once belonged to boys who believed they could change the course of history. Fishermen still tell stories of strange echoes at dawn, voices that whisper from the mist. Some say it's the river remembering, others say it's the wind passing through broken reeds. But to those who know the history of 1939, the meaning is clear. The voices belong to the lost generation of Yueyang. Their story isn't one of victory or defeat. It's one of innocence consumed by war and of memory that refuses to fade. The years that followed the First Battle of Changsha were cruel in their repetition. China's war of resistance dragged on, swallowing entire towns and generations. The Japanese would return to Hunan twice more, and each time Yueyang trembled under the shadow of invasion. Yet something had changed. The memory of the fallen boys spread quietly through the villages, told in whispers, sung in morning songs, recited around dim lanterns during the long winter nights. The people began to call them the Silent Regiment. When new waves of conscription came, older brothers and cousins of those lost volunteered in their place. Many of them carried the same small tokens the child soldiers once held: a lucky coin, a torn ribbon, a school badge, symbols of unfinished lives that still demanded meaning. In this way, the children of Yueyang continued to march, not in body but in memory. A nation in ruins. By 1944, the war had reached its breaking point. The Japanese launched Operation Ikaigo, the largest land offensive in China, sweeping again through Hunan and Guangxi. The horror of 1939 returned tenfold. Villages that had rebuilt were burned again, families that had mourned once found themselves digging new graves. Amid this chaos, the legend of the youth defenders became a rallying cry for resistance propaganda. The story of Li Ming and Captain Zhao Cheng, though altered by rumor and time, was retold in newspapers and pamphlets. The official version painted the boys as martyrs who faced the enemy without fear, their sacrifice a symbol of China's unbreakable will. But those who had truly known them, the mothers, the classmates, the survivors, remembered a quieter truth. They remembered trembling hands clutching rifles too heavy for them. They remembered fear disguised as courage. And they remembered the terrible cost of war that had asked too much from the smallest shoulders. Still, their memory endured because it had to. It was all the people had left to hold on to. After liberation, when the war finally ended in 1945 and Japan surrendered, Yueyang lay in ruins once more. The returning nationalist troops entered a city of ghosts. Every corner still carried the scent of ash. The few survivors of the youth regiments, now young men, wandered the streets searching for home. Many found nothing, no parents, no schools, no trace of their childhood. Wei Jun, now 18, stood by the same wall where he had fought 6 years before. The bullet holes were still there, weathered by time and rain. He placed his hand against the stone and whispered, "We did not die for nothing." But he wasn't sure he believed it. Buried beneath silence. The new political era after 1949 brought both unity and amnesia. The stories of individual suffering were buried beneath grand narratives of national victory. The child soldiers of Yueyang were rarely mentioned again. To speak of them was to speak of a time too painful, too chaotic, too fractured for a nation trying to rebuild its pride. But in the countryside, memory has a way of surviving. In small ancestral temples, families still offered incense on the 7th day of the 9th month when the First Battle of Changsha had begun. They whispered names, some long forgotten by the state, and told the children. These were the boys who stood before men with guns and did not run. Over decades, these private rituals became a quiet rebellion against forgetting. Rediscovery. In 1979, an amateur historian named Chen Guoliang from Changsha University began collecting oral histories from elderly villagers. What he found astonished him: consistent stories from across Hunan about a group of young boys who fought and died in Yueyang during the Japanese invasion. He tracked down one surviving witness, then another, piecing together the fragments. Some remembered a young leader named Li Ming. Others spoke of Captain Zhao's last words, shouted over the thunder of artillery, "Hold the line until the end." Chen's research culminated in a self-published booklet titled The Forgotten Regiment of Yueyang, printed in 1983. It circulated quietly, banned in some regions for its unverified accounts, but treasured by locals as truth reborn. Years later, the booklet would serve as the foundation for documentaries and museum exhibits. What had once been whispers was finally spoken aloud. Echoes in modern Yueyang. Today, if you walk along the Xiang River at dawn, you'll find a modest stone memorial near the riverbank, a simple block of gray granite engraved with a few words. In memory of the youth who fought for our land. September 1939. There are no names, no statues, no grand ceremony. Just silence and wind, the same wind that once carried the sound of gunfire and the cries of boys too young to die. Local students visit every year on Qingming Festival, placing white chrysanthemums by the monument. Some of them don't know the full story, others do, having learned it from grandparents who still remember. And when the flowers are laid, when the crowd disperses, the river remains, flowing endlessly past the ruins, the graves, the invisible scars. For those who listen closely, the past still speaks. Part 8: The Last Witness. Wei Jun lived long enough to see his city transformed beyond recognition. By the 1990s, Yueyang had become a modern industrial hub, factories, bridges, neon lights replacing the ruins of war. Yet he carried the old world with him wherever he went. In his small schoolroom above the blackboard, he kept a faded photograph. A group of boys standing proudly, rifles at their sides, eyes filled with impossible determination. Each morning before class, he would dust the frame and bow his head. His students would ask who they were. He would answer softly, "My brothers." When journalists finally interviewed him late in life, Wei Jun spoke not of vengeance or bitterness but of remembrance. "War takes everything," he said, "but memory, that's how we fight back. As long as someone remembers, we are not dead." He died at age 82 in 2009. At his funeral, former students carried his coffin draped in the old school banner, "Better to die standing than live kneeling." They buried him facing the Xiang River, toward the place where it had all begun. Part 9: The Weight of History. Even now, historians struggle to confirm the exact number of children who fought in Yueyang. Some say dozens, others say hundreds. The truth is buried in mass graves, burned documents, and fading memories. But numbers were never what mattered. What mattered was what they represented: an entire generation forced to grow up at gunpoint. In classrooms across Hunan, teachers sometimes tell their students about the youth of 1939. It's not in official textbooks but in the stories passed from mouth to mouth. And when they speak of Li Ming or Wei Jun, they speak of courage, not the blind courage of propaganda but the quiet kind. The courage to hope when the world is collapsing, to stand when every instinct screams to run. The same courage, perhaps, that still beats faintly in the heart of every nation that has ever faced the darkness of war. Part 10: The River Remembers. The Xiang River continues its endless journey, flowing past Yueyang, past the ruins of battlefields now overgrown with grass. At sunset, the water glows red like fire reflected from the heavens. Locals say that on some evenings, when the fog rolls low and the cicadas fall silent, you can hear the faint echo of footsteps on the wind, small, hurried, rhythmic, the sound of boys marching. Some dismiss it as imagination, others know better. They know that rivers never forget. They remember everything: the laughter, the screams, the final prayers whispered before the gunfire. And so, as the city hums with life and progress, the Xiang flows on, carrying with it the ghosts of 1939, unseen but never gone. The story of the Yueyang child soldiers does not end in the silence of their graves or the faded ink of forgot archives. It lives on in every breath of wind that sweeps across the Xiang River, in every rusted rifle still buried beneath the soil, in every heart that dares to remember what war once demanded from innocence. They were not warriors by choice. They were children, students, sons, dreamers, pulled from classrooms and thrust into the inferno of history. Yet when their world collapsed, they stood, trembling but unbroken, against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Their courage did not come from training or rank but from something far deeper: the human refusal to surrender when everything is lost. When we speak of heroes, we often imagine great generals or grand victories. But the truest heroism is found in the quiet faces of those who never asked to be remembered, who never lived long enough to see the peace they fought for. The boys of Yueyang were nameless in the chronicles of war, yet their story shines brighter than any medal or monument. They remind us that courage is not measured by age or weapon, but by the will to stand in the face of despair and say, "I will not kneel." History has a cruel way of erasing those it deems too small to matter. Nations rebuild, cities rise, flags change, and time buries what cannot be written in stone. But there are truths that resist burial. They whisper through generations, carried in stories told by grandmothers, carved in the lines of old photographs, etched in the memory of rivers. The boys of Yueyang were more than victims. They were the living heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. Their sacrifice was not just for territory or pride, but for the simple, stubborn dream that one day children would no longer have to carry rifles instead of books. As the world moves further from the age of world wars, it is tempting to let the past fade into dust, to believe that such tragedies belong to another time. But every time a child is caught in conflict, every time innocence is sacrificed to ambition, the ghosts of Yueyang rise again. They remind us that the price of forgetting is always repetition. Memory, then, is not just remembrance, it is resistance. Imagine standing by the Xiang River at dusk, the sky burning gold and red. The water is calm now, but beneath its surface lie fragments of a war long over. If you listen closely, you might hear them, the faint echo of youthful voices carried by the wind. They are not crying, they are not shouting. They are singing softly the same song they once marched to, the song of a homeland worth defending. Their voices ask for nothing but this: that we remember them not as lost boys, but as the guardians of a dream that still flows through the veins of every generation that follows. The story of Yueyang is not a tale of defeat. It is a testament to endurance, to the human spirit's ability to rise from ashes, to turn tragedy into memory and memory into meaning. The boys who fought and fell in 1939 gave China something far greater than victory. They gave it its conscience. And though history may not always speak their names, the river still carries their echoes, and every heartbeat of this land is a continuation of their unfinished song. When the sun sets over Yueyang and the mist curls over the river, it is not merely the end of another day, it is the quiet salute of time itself, bowing to those who stood when standing seemed impossible. And as long as their story is told, they will never truly be gone. The river remembers, and through its endless song, so must we.